let's start out with engine repair test. This is the opener for engine repair, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of this stuff that if you're not, if you're foggy about it, we're going to try to clear that up. When you're looking at the valves in a cylinder head, how can you easily identify the intake valves? Anybody know? If you're looking at the valves in the cylinder head, how can you identify the intake valves? Let me see if I can open this closet door.
It looks like a lot of trouble here.
I'm going to pull out a cylinder head. This is a cylinder head.
They're smaller than the exhaust valves, aren't they?
Well, what do you think?
No, they're bigger.
I'm holding this
They
up.
are smaller.
Holding this up. There's a big one and there's a small one. Now, which side of this head?
Oh, they're like the shiny rim.
Yeah, the place where the holes are. That's where the valves go, right? All right, so you got one side of the head the exhaust comes out of, which is going to be this side. All right, this is one of the cylinder heads from a 350. This is the intake side. If you follow those holes, you're going to see that the bigger valve goes to the intake side of the head. The bigger valves are always intake valves. And it's just typically the way it is. If you put 4 valves per cylinder, you basically are able to give more flow because you got more, because of the way it is. All right, I'm going to stand this up right here, and maybe it won't fall on somebody's foot. Okay, the crankshaft completes how many degrees of rotation in order for every cylinder to complete all 4 strokes?
180.
Okay, you're completing all 4 strokes.
720.
Yeah.
What'd you say? What'd you say, Adam?
720.
720. Okay, how many is that? I mean, how many turns is that?
4.
That's 4 turns in it. All right,
4 cylinder.
Yeah, you guys engage now. All right, so you got to go 2 times. Now, what is it? How do you know whenever you talk about an engine that's a 3.0 or a 4.0 or a 5.0 or a 6.6 or whatever? What do those numbers mean?
It's the air displacement, isn't it?
Yeah. So maybe how would you explain that to a 6-year-old?
You don't.
Well, basically, you say if I could turn that engine 2 full turns, and I could catch all the air that it pumped into a bag. If it was a 6-liter engine, I would have 6 liters of air. That's theoretical. But there is something called volumetric efficiency, and what that means is because the air has to make so many curves and go through the filter and go past the throttle body and go around all this, you're not going to have 100% volumetric efficiency. You're not going to get a full 6 liters on a 6-liter engine unless you have turbocharging or supercharging, and then you're shoving it in there, and then you get more than 100%. So that's what the cool thing about turbocharging is. However, what is it that causes the air to go in there anyway?
Going where?
Into the engine. What causes the air to go into the engine? Why does it go in there?
Pressure?
Well, you're not too far off. Basically, what you got is you got pressure at sea level, 14.5 pounds. If you create low pressure, you're going to cause, the higher pressure is going to push whatever's there in the lower pressure. If you put, if you got a drink, I see you guys coming here with drink cups with a straw sticking out of them, right? Okay. How do you get that drink to leave that cup and come into your mouth?
Centrifugal force.
What? Centrifugal force? No, centrifugal force is when you're swinging something around. But what I'm thinking about is atmospheric pressure pushing on the liquid. Because what you do is, you don't even think about it. It's just natural. You start out with a small area in your mouth. You keep going up, and then you make that bigger. And what happens is you're creating low pressure in your mouth, and the atmospheric pressure pushes the stuff through the straw into your mouth. And that's exactly what an engine does. When the piston starts at the top, right, and the intake valve is open and the piston goes down, the only place anything can travel is in that intake valve into that cylinder. And then the intake valve closes and it traps that in there, and then it comes up and squeezes that. Well, when the intake was letting air in, there's also fuel going in there. It squeezes that, and then the spark plug lights off, and then that actually, the controlled burn from that spark plug explosion, gasoline unites with the air, and that's what burnings is, and it pushes that piston down as it expands, and then when it comes back up, the exhaust valve's open, and it pushes the exhaust out, and then the exhaust valve closes, and immediately the intake valve opens, and it goes through that cycle again. And just remember, suck, squeeze, bang, blow. It's pulling it in, squeezing it, blowing it back down, and then it's pushing the exhaust out. And I've got some videos that you can watch on that. In 10 words or less, explain what the camshaft does. You know what the camshaft is, right? The camshaft opens the valves. All right. Let's start out here. This is a crankshaft. And this is a camshaft. Crankshaft, camshaft. Got them? All right, this right here is what spins in the middle of your motor. Power's made. If you're going to crank, you remember when I was telling yesterday, Adam had this little thing. I said crank it up, and he got around to the front of it. And he acted like he was turning a crank, which is pretty cool because that's why they say crank it up, because people used to have a crank that was hooked to the front of the crankshaft, and they'd crank it up. Of course, it would release from the crankshaft when the engine started up, so it wasn't whirling going down the road. But you'd have to retard the timing so you could get it to start. And that clip over on the floor. So anyway, but get used to a crankshaft and a camshaft. That's the one you're going to measure with this measuring worksheet. I got to show you guys that too. Okay, what the camshaft does is it opens the valves. Right? The camshaft opens the valves by way of the lifters or rocker arms or however they're connected. What's the best coolant water mix for most vehicles? 50-50. 50-50 is a good answer. On an engine with a timing belt, how would you determine whether or not the camshaft and the crankshaft are mechanically out of time? Because they got to be timed. You know, the valves have got to open at the right time or the engine's not going to run.
Dots don't match up.
Huh?
Dots don't match up.
Yeah, you basically, to begin with, you got to know where the marks are. I mean, and so you got to be able to tell when the crankshaft is at number 1, top dead center, which means the piston's all the way up and it's in the middle. You also got to know how the camshaft, you know, where the mark is for that. And on some of them, you've actually got a little rubber plug you can pop out, and you can, so that they put it in there so you can see that. But I'm going to line the mark up on the cam before I do anything else. On the simplest thing, like if it's a 4-cylinder, I'm going to line the cam mark up, and then with the cam marks lined up, every time the cam mark lines up, the crank mark lines up every single time. However, if you just line up the crank mark, the cam mark could be either at 6 or at 12. It could be either one because it only turns half the speed, right? Okay, and here's a no-brainer question after that. Oh, to answer that question, I'm going to line up the camshaft mark and see if the crank mark's lined up. That's what I'm going to do. And if it's not, you're out of time. Got it? Does the crankshaft turn faster than the camshaft? Yes or no? What did I just tell you? Which turns faster, crank or cam? If the crank lines up every time and the cam lines up every other time, which one of those is turning faster? Anybody know?
No.
Well, the crankshaft, you know, is spinning twice as fast as the camshaft. It has to, because of that. So, you know, when I told you the camshaft would be lined up every time the camshaft lines up, the crank will be lined up. But every time the crank lines up, the cam may be either halfway out or, see, because it's only turning half the speed. And the gear on the camshaft is twice as big as the one on the crank. This right here is a cam gear off of a 5.4. It's actually a cam phaser, but that's what the size of the cam gear is. And the crank gear is only like this big around. It's a little bitty thing. And so basically this was only going to turn half as fast. All right, here we go. Let's keep going. Which shaft drives the oil pump on an engine usually? I say usually because that's a totally screwed up answer, but you could basically answer it right by giving the right. These are short answer questions. What is it that drives the oil pump? You see you see that top shelf up there above your head? The very top shelf? Not the top, but the top. All of those are oil pumps. You see the one with the long stem sticking out of it up there? That one's driven by the distributor, which is driven by the camshaft. And so the oil pump on that one turns half the, you know, that gear in there turns half of crankshaft speed because it's driven by the camshaft. Now the other one, there's another one up there, the one that's standing up, the oil pump is driven by the timing belt. That's on a Toyota Camry. But on a lot of engines, on a growing number of them, the oil pump is on the nose of the crankshaft. And it's that little gerotor pump, you know, and they've all got relief valves. The one that's got the stem sticking up, the relief valve is built into the, basically the release valve is a little plunger with a spring, and when the pressure builds up, it squeezes that spring, and that's what gives you oil pressure. You don't have oil pressure without having a relief valve of some kind. You know, so the oil pump moves oil, but it doesn't make the pressure. The pressure comes from having restriction, and that's what the relief valve does. More about that later. But anyway, on some of them the crank drives it, on some the timing belt drives it, and on some the camshaft drives it. So you can't really say it's always driven by the same thing on any engine. If the cylinder diameter, the bore, is greater than the stroke, that engine is referred to as A over square, B under square. Let's watch this. Let me see if I, yeah, if the bore, let's say the bore is 4 inches, okay, and the piston travel up and down is 3 inches, right? That's over square. Now the way I remember that, I would have memory bugs to remember things if you've got two things and either one of them could be. Basically, this one is a bigger number than that one, so and it's over the other one, right? But watch this. What if this is a 3-inch diameter and that's 4-inch? That's under square. Wherever the bigger number is going to be where it's going to be. If the bigger number's up here, it's over. If the bigger number's down here, it's under. Get that? Not complicated, is it? Okay. Now that's something you're not going to use that when you're fixing vehicles. There's some of these principles I'm supposed to teach you, but you're not going to use it when you're fixing a car. So, you know, you can it's good to know that for a test. How is the piston ring end gap different from the piston ring side gap?
Looser.
Huh?
Looser.
Good. Whoa, Brad. Okay. All right, watch this. I'm going to take this ring off of this piston, right? Okay. Whenever I'm building an engine and I buy rings for it, I'm going to take this ring and I'm going to put it down in the cylinder. And I'm going to let it just be down in the cylinder like it would be if it was on a piston, but it's not going to be on a piston. And I'm going to take my feeler gauge and I'm going to measure between the two tips of that ring. Got it? That's end gap.
Oh.
Side gap is how much movement the ring has in the land on the piston. Because as it's going up and down, these wear, see? And so you're going to take a feeler gauge on an old piston that you're going to see if you're trying to reuse it. Most of the time, if you're doing an engine right, you're going to bore it 10 over and put new pistons and everything in it anyway. But the long and the short of it is you got the gap that's between the ring and the land is what side gap is. So don't get those confused. Remember, end gap is the ends of the ring, side gap's the side of the ring. That's not too hard. But you got to have it on the piston to measure side gap. Got me? Yeah, I mean, the ring's got to be on the piston. All right. Okay.
So what's the answer?
Huh?
So what's the answer?
Oh, what's the answer? End gap, you're measuring between the two ends of the piston ring. Side gap, you're measuring between the piston ring and the piston. You know, because it's riding in a groove, and how much wear that groove has is what you're measuring when you do that. What is a torque to yield bolt? A torque to yield bolt. Anybody remember that? I used to have some of them around here. So you can look at them usually and tell what's going on with a torque to yield bolt. This is not a torque to yield bolt, it's just a bolt. But the head bolts are the ones that are most commonly torque to yield, and what that means is you look at your torque spec, and you've done enough of this where you know what torque spec is. You get your torque wrench and you pull it until it clicks on a particular torque. You set it on where it'll click. So when you pull it and it clicks, you're going to say, like on the first time I ever run into those, there was an Escort I was working on, putting the head back on it, and it said 44 foot-pounds, click, 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 and then you go back and you go another 90 degrees on each bolt, and then you go another 90 degrees. You actually go from a torque, you put your torque wrench away, you get your big breaker bar, and you know 90 degrees is 15 minutes on the clock, right? It ain't hard to figure out. You just take it and pull it 90 degrees. You follow your torque pattern, then you go back and you go another 90 degrees. It's not the same on every one, but that's an example of a torque to yield bolt. Now the other thing you need to remember about torque to yield bolts is they have to be replaced whenever you're like if you pull the head off of one, and it's got torque to yield bolts, you're basically going to replace the bolts with new bolts instead of having them, because they stretch, see? That's what torque to yield bolts all about. What's the difference between CF classification motor oil and SF classification motor oil? On the can of oil, you're going to see CF or SF along with those other numbers that gives you the specification.
CF is diesel and the other one is for gasoline.
Very good, Adam. The CF is compression fired versus spark fired. You got that? Write that down. What if you're checking a vehicle with an oil pressure gauge that reads 0 all the time? What's the first thing you're going to do? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug the wire from the oil pressure sending unit, and I'm going to ground that wire through a test light, hook a test light to ground that wire, and I'm going to see if the gauge responds to that. If the gauge responds to my test light, then I'm going to screw the oil pressure sending unit out, and I'm going to put an actual gauge in there, and I'm going to crank it up, and I'm going to see what it reads. Got me? All right. And that was just a real quick overview to give you a little bit of something you could chew on. And
What was 12?
12, I'm going to unplug the oil pressure sending unit, and I'm going to basically short it to ground through a test light and see if the gauge responds to that. If it doesn't, I got gauge problems. Right? Now you could have a bad oil pressure sending unit, but I'm listening for engine noises when all this is going on too. If I hear rattling or anything like that, I'm thinking maybe we do have low oil pressure. If you start it up with the engine cold and it's got good oil pressure, you need to let it warm up with your master gauge on it and see if it goes down. Because after the oil gets thinner, if there's any worn bearings or anything, it's letting oil squirt out, you're going to have issues with that, you know. So.